Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and last week my beloved Denver Broncos suffered yet another humiliating loss. And in the process of that, their quarterback, who I think is a really good dude and a decent quarterback, and I don't want to pile on him too much, but his name's Teddy Bridgewater. There's a situation where a defender from the other team recovered a fumble and starts running the other way. So for those of you who don't know American football, it's not really Teddy Bridgewater's job to tackle people. He's the guy who throws the ball. He doesn't play defense. He doesn't stop people. But the tables were turned in an odd moment in the game, and that's like the pivotal moment in the whole season. And the guy with the football is running right at Teddy Bridgewater, and Teddy just stepped out of the way and let the dude run for a free touchdown all the way to the other end of the field. And understandably, he kind of got murdered in the press and in public opinion. Like, everybody wants these guys to be warriors and sacrifice their bodies for the game. I mean, the game is kind of a sacrifice of one's body. And the term that kept getting thrown around was business decision. Teddy made a business decision. In a moment, he read the playing field and was like, this isn't good for me. Somebody else can put their neck on the line, but I'm not going to do it. And I don't say this because I got any judgment from him. Every single person that's willing to go play that sport is a braver person than me. But I bring it up because I think we can all relate to the concept of a business decision. A time where, we see what the reality of what's going on here is, but I don't think I'm going to say anything about that in front of everybody just right now. Well, likewise, we see people throughout the book of Matthew making business decisions, doing the safe, politically astute thing to avoid any kind of friction or danger, or laying their body on the line for what might happen. And then we see Jesus, who, yes, at times falls back, bides his time. Clearly what he's doing there is teaching and building up his disciples and ministering to more people. But eventually, as we're seeing in the chapters we're looking at in the book of Matthew right now, we discover he's not a business decision kind of guy. He's someone who's willing to put his reputation, his name, his body on the line to say out loud in front of everyone what he's been willing to say in private. And so back in Matthew chapter 15, we see that Jesus makes a bit of a pivot in terms of how he talks about the Pharisees. Is it 15? No, it's 16. He makes a bit of a pivot even with his own disciples. He's kind of been hinting like, these guys, look how they are, look what they're doing. But then he comes right out and says in 16:6, be careful, Jesus said to them, the disciples, be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And then you'll recall the disciples discussed it and they were like, oh no, by yeast he means bread. We forgot to bring sandwiches on our boat trip. Oh, we blew it. He's probably mad at us. And then Jesus is like, you have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered, or the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls you gathered? I mean, it was like a chapter ago, paraphrases mine. How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. Well, that's an inside conversation that Jesus is having back in chapter 16. And if you're reading through Matthew for the first time at that point, you don't really know how this thing is going to end. Maybe Jesus is just going to build some sort of quiet resistance movement, but never really say these things out loud. But then in the ensuing chapters, as Jesus is like, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man is going to be handed over. He's going to be killed, and the religious leaders are going to be the ones who do it. And then he goes to Jerusalem. You're like, oh, no, okay, I get it. He's going to go put his body on the line. He is going to go out and say this quiet stuff out loud in front of everyone, and he's going to willingly accept the consequences for whatever happens because of that. And that's really what we're getting to in chapter 23. We've had this dramatic buildup through chapters 21 and 22, just shots fired both directions, Pharisees, Sadducees, firing back and forth with Jesus. Jesus has demonstrated remarkable patience with them. Even in a way, it seems like he's pleading with them to hear him on this. But we get to the end of chapter 23 after they have the discussion about Psalm 110:1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. And then Jesus says, if then David calls him being the Messiah, Lord, how can he be his son? And at that point, the conversation's just over. It's clear to everyone involved. The Pharisees can't give you an answer because Jesus is right. He's reading the text correctly, and his understanding of the Messiah is right, and their understanding of the Messiah is a mutation. It's an alteration of what is described in the Old Testament, and it's a mutation or alteration that just happens to fit their ends, some of which I'm sure were noble and sympathetic. But as we had documented very well over the last couple of days, listening to that conversation between Jeff the Pharisee and his excellent listener friend Mike, the relationship is broken. These are irreconcilable ideas. There really isn't a point of compromise that can be made here. If the Pharisees compromise, they're effectively out of a job if they acknowledge at all that Jesus has a point. To acknowledge he's right is to acknowledge we whiffed on everything we've been teaching you. It would destroy the institution that is their lives, their existence, everything they know. They're not gonna do it. And Jesus can't compromise on what he's saying. What would be the compromise that they want? Say you're not the son of David. Say you're not the Messiah. Well, he is the Messiah. What they want him to say, he cannot say. What they demand that he give them, he cannot give them. So then we go from that apparent stalemate at the end of 22 that we've been looking at into chapter 23, and it's on. All of the condemnations that Jesus has been saying in private, starting explicitly in that passage we were looking at in chapter 16, all of that stuff becomes entirely public. So in chapter 23, verse 1 opens like this. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples. So whatever he's going to say next, I picture it going like this. You get the 3 showdown questions. Well, where do you get the authority to do this stuff? Should you pay taxes to Caesar? And who's married to who when everybody dies in the afterlife? And then you get the polite question that comes up toward the end of this whole heated exchange from Glenn the Pharisee, who's like, well, what's the greatest commandment? And Glenn's like, oh, that was pretty good. And then you get the one last pleading from Jesus about Psalm 110:1 that we just looked at. So all of this has been happening in front of everybody. This is in and around the temple. People are gathering. They're coming together and listening in on this, hands on hips, arms folded, nodding, as one side says one thing, as the other side says the other thing, trying to make up their minds. That squishy middle we've been talking about, they are right here. They are the background characters in this scene. And Jesus goes eyebrows up with the Pharisees. He makes this one more plea, and they're like, yeah, what do you want us to do? Like, we can't give you what you want. We're not going to say that. To acknowledge that what you're saying is true is the end of us. And then I picture between the end of 22 and the beginning of 23, Jesus pivots to the room and he's like, all right, heads up. We're doing this thing. And he's speaking to everyone now, the disciples and the crowds. He's not saying this directly to the Pharisees. He's more saying this at the Pharisees for the benefit of the crowds and the disciples. And here's a little sample of what we're going to get over the next few days. Hey, everybody, paraphrases mine there. This part isn't a paraphrase. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, so you must obey them and do everything they tell you. But don't do what they do, for they don't practice what they preach. They tie up heavy loads and put them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. So you can see just with a little tiny sample where the tone of this conversation is headed. Jesus is willing to say the things that are true that he was telling the disciples in private, out loud, in front of everybody. He's willing to put his body on the line. He is not making a business decision. He is making the courageous decision. What he's accusing the Pharisees of is making a business decision. Self-preservation is their motivation. Self-promotion, self-aggrandizement, that's what they're going to, because they say to do things that are so important that they say it from the authoritative seat of Moses. But they're not willing to do a dang bit of it while also judging you and holding you accountable to make sure you do the things that they're not willing to do. They're not willing to put their body on the line. They're not willing to put themselves on the line. But with what Jesus is doing right here, he is putting himself on the line. Apologies to Teddy Bridgewater if any of this sounds like I think that he's a bad guy or did a bad thing. That's not what I mean. I'm just trying to relay the controversy. I think you're great, Teddy. I wouldn't have wanted to get hit by that guy either. More on chapter 23 tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.